Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the final session of the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance Global Summit. We've been down in the trenches earlier today looking at individual case studies and experiences of implementing shared spectrum regulation. And now we go to the almost interplanetary level of the four-year process, or the process that culminates every 4 years in creating new standards for telecom regulation and spectrum regulation, in particular, the World Radio Congress. And now looking ahead to World Radio Congress in 2023, we have a session moderated by one of the pioneers of dynamic spectrum at Ofcom and now an independent consultant, William Webb, CEO of Web Search. Welcome, William.
Thank you, Steve. Looking forward to this one. So, WRC, of course, is crucial in the world of spectrum management. It's where a number of the major decisions are taken, including a number of key decisions that are coming up, and we've already been talking about a bit during this conference, such as sharing or licensed use or unlicensed use in things like the 6 gigahertz band. So it's really important that we understand what's coming up, what the key issues are, where the key problems lie, and where the role is for sharing in amongst all that. Can sharing be used to resolve some of the tensions and challenges with particular assignments? And indeed, should sharing be more inherently part of the WRC process than it currently is? And so to look into that, we've got a great panel. We've got 5 speakers covering pretty much the globe, covering major regions around the world, and many of them are part of the regional groups of spectrum regulators that coalesce together before forming and taking their views into WRC, and will be taking their views into WRC-23. So we're going to follow the same approach that most of the other panels have adopted. We will hear for about 5 minutes from each of our 5 panelists, and then we'll start a discussion and debate. And as before, very strongly encourage you all to chip in with questions, with thoughts, with ideas that might seed that debate. And hopefully we can have a fertile discussion that concludes the day and indeed the conference nicely by tying together many of the issues that we've been talking about during the last 3 days. So with no more ado, let me start off with our first panelist, and that's John Omo. John is the Secretary General of the African Telecommunications Union, or ATU. Prior to that, he's worked with the Communications Authority in Kenya, the Kenyan regulator, where he's provided leadership over their legal matters and their strategies. And before that, he's had roles in public and civil service. John, over to you for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, William, for the introduction. I thought I would ask you to shut up as you are going on with the intro, because there are aspects of it that you don't want to have in such a forum. But nonetheless, I want to thank the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance team and fellow panelists for joining in this very important discussion. I work for the African Telecommunications Union, the specialized organ of the African Union Commission that is responsible for coordinating matters of ICT development in Africa, including coordinating Africa's participation at the various World Radio Conferences. Now, key to our activities during this cycle, that is the cycle leading to the World Radio Conference 2023, we are, of course, implementing the regulations that were agreed on at the World Radio Conference 2019. We've commenced our preparations for the World Radio Conference 2023, including a discussion on the future of the UHF band. Part of what we are doing currently as the African Telecommunications Union, we've established various task teams that are working on various agenda items leading to the World Radio Conference 2023, and we do hope that our second meeting somewhere in Benin early next year will give us the roadmap in terms of how those task teams have done. In terms of the other radio activities that we are undertaking currently, Africa's FM broadcasting plan was developed in Geneva in 1984, and we do think that there's room for expansion, and so we're working with the ITU in terms of looking at opportunities for getting new channels for FM in Africa. We are also working currently on an African spectrum allocation plan. We are doing a study on satellite resources in Africa. We are doing a study on and leading to a strategy on digital sound broadcasting in Africa. We are also working on recommendations of implementing various technologies such as WiGig and 5G in Africa, and developing various aspects of spectrum management, including licensing, evolution, and audit. Now, in terms of dynamic spectrum management in Africa, of course, spectrum sharing has been a key issue in Africa, and we do implement it in terms of how the various radio conferences regulations do provide. But key in Africa, what we have seen so far is in the realm of TV white space in some portions of the UHF band for DTT, where South Africa and Malawi are actively working in that space. But so far, it's been at country level, largely because we do not yet have a regional, endeavor towards a more dynamic way of dealing with that part of the spectrum TV white spaces. And we are still quite not at congruence in terms of how to deal with TV white spaces. And we do hope that the future WRC agenda on UHF band is seen as a way of settling that debate in some parts of Africa, and in terms of how we could deal with TV white spaces. So in the realm of dynamic spectrum management, I would say that in Africa, it's only in the area of TV white spaces that we have seen some movement in terms of spectrum sharing in a dynamic way. Let me end there and hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And if you've got to start somewhere, TV white space is a great place to start in my book. Excellent. Let's move on to our second panelist, and that is Tariq Al-Awadhi, who is the Executive Director of Spectrum Affairs at the Department of the Telecoms Regulatory Authority, or TRA, in the United Arab Emirates. He's got a long heritage in spectrum management, over 24 years, chairing ITU World Radio conferences, heading ITU groups and meetings, and is currently chairman of the Arab Spectrum Management Group, or ASMG. So outstanding knowledge in this space. Tariq, over to you.
Thank you very much, William. I'd like, first of all, to thank Dynamic Spectrum Alliance and the team for organizing this summit or this seminar. And it is a privilege for us to participate as ASMG. I'd like to thank all the panelists here in this session for joining us to give a brief about spectrum utilization in the region. As you're aware, that ASMG is a group which is established by the Arab League in 2001 for regulating and managing the radio frequency spectrum or radio communication services among all Arab countries. And since that time, the Arab group already working together as one team to manage the spectrum in a very efficient way and utilizing the radio communication services and bringing new technologies. Of course, the ASMG group is one of the active regional group participating in all IQR study groups, working parties, and of course, since WRC. And the last WRC is Sharm Sheikh. Hopefully, the WRC 2023 it will be held here again in the Arab group in UAE. And already we are working on that one to make the success host of coming WRC. With regard to the how the important things that we are looking to the WRC-23. At 23 WRC, there are several agenda items, very important agenda items, talking about the IMT band. We have 5 agenda items almost, agenda 1, 1, 2, 1.5, and others also in different various bands. There are some new technologies talking about HIPS, eSIMs, new frequencies for satellite, NGSO, or others, and those all are interesting of the Arab group as well. Is aware that in the Arab group have already made the number of frequency band to be used for 5G. I can give you, for example, here in the UAE, just last month we have announced to and allocated almost 400 megahertz to both operators in millimeter wave. And then before 2 years, the UAE and among other Arab group has already assigned 3.4 to 3.8 frequency band for 5G to operators. This is looking at how the Arab countries are really keen to see new technologies coming to their countries. And for that one also, the last ASMG group meeting, which was held in Abu Dhabi here in February for starting the preparation for WRC-23, we have created a new working group under the ASMG. This working group mainly to look to the technologies and to see which spectrum that can be used for new technologies. If the radio regulation, for example, it's still not having that allocation. For example, we have assigned to this group to study the 600 megahertz band and to study also the synchronization between the cross-border for 2.6 and 3.5 also. The channel plan for L-band, those things that they are working and studying by this working group in order to come up with a very quick decision on how to use those spectrum for the new technologies between the Arab group. I'd like to mention one important thing here. There are a number of frequency bands which been used for legacy system. I say legacy because it's very old system among some countries, and they would like to see now new technologies. So although that the radio regulation and the radio regulation Article 5 has services, not technology. Maybe some several technologies are there like IMT or HAPS or ESV. However, it is about the services. Maybe you can see from Arab group for UHF band that we are asking some countries to have additional services for mobile, allowing for those countries who's wishing to go for mobile and to use that mobile, and those countries who are wishing to use broadcasting, they can continue broadcasting. But I just would like to mention here one thing, very important thing for all of us to see it. What is the future? Future who will be using this technology? We are still looking for TV, for example, TV to be used or to be watched by our young generation or future generation. Right now, if we can see it right now, the young generation, all of them, they are using or watching tablets. They are not using or watching TVs. Maybe only old people. I can tell you this one here in our region, UAE. When we did the viewership here some years ago for TV, it was very less than 1% who's watching terrestrial TV. Most of them, they are using satellite or cable. But right now, even that one, it is not that popular as our young generation who's watching the TV by using tablets. So in summary, that you can say that when we are looking now for preparation for WRC-23, we have to see the future. What is the future? Who are the user, the potential user for those radio services? I can stop here and thank you very much again, William.
Thank you, Tariq. That was really helpful. And absolutely agree. We need to make sure that we don't promulgate services when people have moved to completely different methods of viewing or listening or whatever. So really important point. Great, let's move on. So our third speaker is Oscar León. He was elected Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission of Telecommunications in 2015. Before that, he was the General Director of the National Spectrum Agency of Colombia for almost 5 years. He's also served as the Regulatory Manager for Claro Colombia and has been an advisor to the Ministers of Telecommunications and Presidents of Regulators in Latin America. Oscar, over to you.
Thank you so much, William, for the introduction. And also thank you, DSA, and especially my friend Marta Suarez for this invitation. In the America region, we have 34 countries and more than 100 associate members. And we are currently defining the new structure of the working groups on the WRC preparations. And also we are selecting a spokesperson for each agenda item and updating the procedures to agree the Inter-American proposal. I think that maybe it's first important to clarify that my opinions here are not a CITEL position, because we are in an early stage of the WRC-23 to present our positions, and our members, they have different schedules to implement decisions of the previous WRCs. I will show you in this first part the main initiatives that we have at the Americas, and in the second part, I will share my thoughts related with the spectrum sharing in preparation of the WRC-23. Definitely, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted in the Americas one of our biggest challenges, the digital inequalities, and not just between countries, but also within countries, mainly disparities in access to connectivity and online security is concerned. These disparities are also due to delayed schedules to assign spectrum licenses, permissions, delay to adopt new technologies and new approaches to have a more efficient use of the spectrum, especially in some countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, where at least 77 million people who live in rural territories, rural areas of Latin America and the Caribbean lack connectivity with minimum standards of connectivity quality, which is equivalent to half of that available in urban areas. For that reason, CITEL is working with the Americas countries and with the support of our associate members in different initiatives and projects. And one of the main initiatives is the 23 ICT Alliance. It has the purpose of securing resources and concrete outcomes that would contribute, among others, to connect and connected, promoting digital training to raise the quality of education in the America, and to develop talent for the new digital economy. Under this initiative, CITEL has agreement with Telefónica, Millicom, Cisco, American Mobile, ISOG, Viasat, Facebook, and AT&T, mainly oriented to connect the unconnected and digital literacy, and now in conversation with DSA as a light to promote efficient use of the spectrum. Other initiative is the Rural Women's Alliance. It is aimed to fostering the adoption of specific actions to improve the connectivity of remote or underserved rural areas and developing digital services and capabilities to facilitate the use of ICTs, in particular by women and girls, focusing on enhancing the development of economies and production processes of those areas, training women entrepreneurs from the areas identified for commercial development through ICTs. And finally, last week, CITEL approved a set of 17 recommendations to support the countries in the adoption of policies and regulations oriented to reduce digital divide in served and underserved areas. I only want to highlight some of those recommendations as fostering and supporting the implementation of business models that motivate the entry of new economic agents and promote their financial sustainability, boosting public and private investment, as well as public public-private ventures, partnerships, and sharing resources, promoting cooperation and dismantling barriers to deployment of infrastructure between central and local governments. It means to resolve the issues of permits and rights of way, periodically examining the regulation applicable in order to respond quickly to specific demands on needs of connectivity. It's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oscar. And I think important to bring up issues, well, like connecting non-connective, and also the impact of COVID, and that clearly has led to a significant change in the use of radio systems and the importance of radio systems. And perhaps something we'll come back to talk about, both its direct impact and whether the timescales of WRC can react sufficiently fast to that kind of event. But let's move on now to our fourth panelist, and that is Alexandra Collod, who is the head of international frequency planning at the Swiss Federal Office of Communications, also called Ofcom, just like the UK one. In this role, he leads the Swiss preparation for WRCs and is also responsible for international satellite coordination. He's got a very illustrious past. He's chaired many different groups and tasking activities in CEPT and the ITU, and he currently serves as chair of the CEPT Conference Preparatory Group for WRC-23. Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you, William, and good time of the day to everyone. Thank you for having me here in this panel, and many thanks, muchas gracias, to the president of the DSA, Marta, for having invited me here to attend this forum. As this panel is related to the 2023 conference, and in order to set the scene from the CPT perspective, I would like just to recall that the CPT preparation for the conference is conducted in so-called Conference Preparatory Group, as William said. This is a forum for 48 CPT administrations and numerous observers from international organizations and the industry. And the primary responsibility of the CPG is to prepare European common proposals for the work of the conference and also the radio assembly. In this regard, we are maintaining open dialogue with all regional organizations, recognizing that the inter-regional cooperation is a key element for the success of the conference. Of the many issues to be resolved by 2023 conference, two are likely to be of high interest for the DSA members, I believe. And it happens that both of these issues will be certainly highly contentious and time-consuming at the next conference. I mean here, of course, agenda item 1.2 on possible IMT identification in the mid-bands and 6 GHz band in particular, as well as agenda item 1.5 on the review of the UHF band. So what can be said briefly on these bands, on these agenda items from the CPT perspective and in the context of this DSA forum? Touching upon first the 6 GHz band, namely the upper part of it, clearly so-called classical issues associated with this agenda item needs to be resolved first. I mean here the protection of the incumbent services in the band, as well as the consideration of the fact that part of this band is subject to the FSS plan in Appendix 30B of the radio regulations. However, what comes on top of it is the technology competition, IMT versus Erlang, or license versus unlicensed use of this band. In this respect, I should say that we in CPT are now in the process of approval of an ACC decision that addresses the designation of the lower part of the 6 GHz band for the implementation of Erlang. Therefore, the upper part of the 6 GHz band will continue to be attractive for Erlang implementation as well. It is too early to say now or to foresee the developments on this agenda item within CPT. However, I recall here similar discussions we had at the previous conference in 2019, where the IMT versus YGIC competition in the 6671 GHz band resulted in an IMT resolution that is different from classical, I would call them classical IMT resolution for other IMT bands. Now, a few words about Agenda Item 1.5, revision of the UHF ban. Knowing a particular attention that was given in recent years to so-called television white spaces, I believe the DSA members are following very close the developments on this agenda item. We all understand that a primary expectation of the proponents for the studies under this agenda item is to seek the primary mobile allocation of this band, and though it is not said explicitly in the red resolution, the idea is certainly to have an IMT identification. A recent questionnaire that was issued by ITR Working Party 6A showed that an absolute majority of European countries consider that they would need the whole band for 70 to 694 MHz to continue to deliver the digital terrestrial broadcasting services. Therefore, if the IMT identification is indeed to take place in this band, the next conference will also need to specify very carefully the access conditions to allow both the broadcasting and the mobile services to coexist practically. Well, having said this, I would like also to emphasize that the CEPT preparation towards the 2023 conference is consistent with the ECC strategic plan for the 2020-2025 period, which was approved in July this year. And this plan identifies few major topics that we in CC are going to address over the next 5 years. And these are the review of the UHF band, in line with the agenda item 1.5. Also, wireless broadband and connectivity, including wireless mobile broadband and airline, in line with agenda item 1.2. And we will also address issues relating to general authorization and license exempt use of spectrum, like SRDs, Internet of Things, and other similar use of spectrum. And one of the strategic principles in implementing this plan is spectrum sharing. In particular, we believe in the ECC that the appearance, the emergence of new technologies such as cognitive radio and geolocation database may and would enable the implementation of the licensed and unlicensed shared use of spectrum. And therefore, the CEPT will promote spectrum sharing through its technical and regulatory work. Let me end here and hand over the word to you, William. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. And yes, it's good to remind us of how contentious matters can get at WRC and indeed in many forums. It doesn't feel like the right way to tackle these problems to have two competing blocks of interested parties, but it's the way that we have at the moment. And maybe, and we can talk more about this when we get to the panel session, spectrum sharing is perhaps one approach that might soften that contention. We'll see. Right, let's move on to our last panelist, and that's Muneo Awadhi. And he is one of the leading lights in the APT, the Asia Pacific Telecoms Group. He has many activities there. He's currently vice chair for the conference preparatory group for the WRC-23. He's been the chair for satellite issues and indeed has been an ITU vice chair as well. He is currently the executive manager at Mitsubishi and in the past has worked for KDDI. Muneo, over to you, and thank you for joining us so late at night or so early in your morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webb, for introduction. And hello, good day to everyone. I'm from Japan. It's after midnight, up to 2 o'clock in the morning. And let me start with the explanation about the APT situation. APT, Asia Pacific Telecommunity, consists of 38 member countries in Region 3 in ITU's definition. It covers a wide area. The countries located at eastern end is Samoa, and the country located at the western end is Iran. Concerning APG, APT Conference Preparatory Group meets once or twice a year in order to harmonize the views of APT countries on each agenda item of WRC. In this cycle, we plan to have 6 APG meetings before WRC-23, but start of our activities delayed due to COVID-19. We could convene the first meeting of APG virtually in last September. It was short 2-day meetings, and we decided only the structure of APG. We set up 5 working parties, and we selected chairman of APG, Dr. Wee of Korea, 2 vice chairmen, including myself, and chairman of working parties. Our second meeting is scheduled for the next March. There, we will start actual discussions on each agenda item. Compared with other regions, APT countries have less commonality. There are countries with large areas, countries with many diverse islands, countries with high population density and lower density, etc. Economy development levels vary. Diversity is one key feature of APT. It is not so easy to develop harmonized views from the ground of little commonality. In each cycle of WRC, we had to make extra effort to reach common proposal. For this cycle, an idea raised was to convene virtual or informal meetings on some specific agenda items between formal APG's meetings or even after the final APG meeting. We will consider this idea seriously at later meeting. We also consider that communications among 6 regional groups are important. In recent WRCs, controversial issues have been coordinated among regional groups. So understanding the situation of other regions is beneficial for us to develop our proposal. Concerning dynamic sharing, introduction of dynamic spectrum sharing is studied and considered at national government levels. In WRC-19, about 15 GHz spectrum was identified for IMT usage. But there are some existing services allocated in these bands. Dynamic spectrum sharing is considered to be a possible way to introduce new IMT systems in the newly identified bands. In APT, our technical group, AWG, APT Wires Group, generated a survey report on dynamic spectrum sharing as a national solution to access spectrum for IMT. I believe this report has served as a good reference to APT countries. With this, I hand over the microphone to Mr. Webb. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And good to remind us that even within regions, there can be great diversity of needs of different countries. We've heard how diverse we are from one region to another, but it's important to remember that even regions are not homogeneous. Great. Let's bring back the whole panel and move into the open panel session. So I'd encourage everyone out there, please to send in questions. We've already got some coming in, and I'll feed those into the discussion. But keep them coming, not just questions, but also thoughts, opinions that we can pick up and discuss as well. That's also great. So I'm going to kick things off by asking whether the WRC process is almost inherently anti-sharing. We've got as Alexandra said, often in a process that leads to a lot of controversy, a very combative kind of who's the winner going to be, who's going to get the primary allocation for this band. And it doesn't seem to be one that actually starts off by saying, how can we all share this one equally? Rather, it's mine or it's yours. Is that right? Should we think about potentially changing our process towards one that starts by saying, can we all share, before perhaps eventually concluding that we can't, rather than saying who's going to be the winner in this particular battle for primacy in this particular spectrum block? So I'll throw that out there. It sounds a bit utopian, but anyone want to comment on that?
I think process issues are fairly, if I can have a go, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
I think process issues are fairly issues where people can prefer an opinion. But inherently, I think the WRC process is pro-sharing. I think the WRC process is pro-sharing. You may have, legacy networks that have used or sat on certain resources for a while, and certainly, we have instances where various services have sat on resources for a while, and they would justify the need to, continue the use of those resources. But there are indeed many instances today where a band is allocated to more than one primary service in WRC, and that for me then lends credence to the view that the WRC process is not anti-sharing as such. For example, you have 694 to 790 megahertz band shared between mobile, except of course for aeronautical mobile, and shared between mobile and broadcasting. 790 to 862 megahertz shared between fixed mobile, of course, again, except aeronautical mobile, and also broadcasting. You have 942 and 960 megahertz between fixed mobile and broadcasting. And so a clear majority of WRC allocations in the current radio regulations, I would say, for more than one primary service. I think the issue with dynamic spectrum sharing philosophy essentially is that these allocations are at the level of principle. And so, at operational levels, countries, still typically choose one of the services due to, the operational challenges associated with sharing. But as more and more radio services and wireless services, for that matter, wireless technologies come into being, that would necessitate that we adopt and devote our resources more to new and innovative approaches to sharing. But in principle, I don't think the WRC process itself is inimical or anti-sharing as such. And so I think, of course, as you say, more and more of our resources need to be invested in looking at ways of opening up new channels for innovative sharing, so that we have more and more services that are necessitated by new wireless technologies, able to access and use those services appropriately. Of course, we also need to take into account, as I said earlier, the need to protect incumbent services that have invested or sat on those some of those resources for a while, and also preventing interference. You would not want to dynamically share resources when either new or other non-protected entrants cause interference with either legacy or fellow new process is difficult to criticize or say it's perfect, because it involves quite a bit of what resources are we investing in improving whatever process we have in order to ensure that what we have commonly agreed on, that new wireless technologies are necessitating that we adopt new and innovative approaches for sharing spectrum dynamically. And so we just need to audit whether that process serves us, and if there are loopholes into it, how we can improve on it. But I think of itself, it's not inimical, it's not anti-dynamic spectrum sharing. That is my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Oscar, you wanted to say something on this?
Yeah, I'm thinking similar to John, that I believe that the WRC process doesn't tend to select a primary service for each band. Even if you see the Article 5 of the radio regulation, it can be seen that the trend is that in the most cases there are multiple primary services in the band. In fact, most of the work in the study cycles is focused on producing the sharing and compatibility study between services. And the result of those studies often lead to technical conditions to avoid interferences. And those technical conditions can be met by using sharing techniques. And the studies can leverage such tools to develop a new set of technical requirements based on that efficient use approach. I think that with the technological advances, it is increasingly likely that multiple primary services share a band. Sharing is an option that administration can already undertake. It is a matter of review of the regulatory framework, as countries have done with the TV white spaces or unlicensed spectrum, such as Wi-Fi spectrum in 2.4 or 5G gigahertz bands. Then, if the technology will continue improving and it is possible to reach a point in full dynamic use and sharing for different technologies and services, at that point, the radio regulation still will be an essential reference to administration wishing to implement different technologies in the different services.
Alexandre, you wanted to talk on this as well.
Yeah, thank you, William. Just to complement what was said previously by John and Oscar, I believe that the conferences are authorized to address virtually all aspects of spectrum use. Therefore, it is possible to allocate multiple services to a given band. In order for the conference to proceed with such allocation, the studies should demonstrate convincingly the simultaneous need for this band by these multiple services, and that sharing is possible. And moreover, the conferences are already doing such allocations. It does not appear within a single agenda item, but when we combine different agenda items. For example, if I take agenda item 1.2 of the next conference, it seeks to allocate, among others, the bands 3.3, 3.4 gigahertz for the mobile service in region 2. And at the same time, agenda item 1.18 seeks to find the portions of this band for the mobile satellite service in the same region, region 2. And the responsible working parties of ITU will need to exchange the necessary information, including protection criteria, to address mutual compatibility and sharing feasibility. So just to conclude, it is true that the conference addressed mainly technological innovations in a radio service in a given band. However, it is a reality that the technological innovations are ongoing in many radio services. Therefore, it is not excluded that the conference decides to select more than one primary service for a given frequency band. Thank you.
And that'll make sense. I mean, I'm interested in a question that's cropped up from Graham McDonald from Apple, who mentions that within the ITU you can't talk about licensing mechanisms, so you can't consider whether an identification is actually necessarily appropriate. Do you think it would be better if the primary allocation or secondary allocations actually said, this allocation is designed for dynamic database access or something like that, and these could be discussed as part of the actual process that takes place, and indeed the designation within the IT regulations. Not clear. Anyone want to have a go at that?
I may answer to that one. First of all, regarding, I will just comment very quick about the sharing possibilities. I agree with the comments made by my colleagues here about the sharing process and the ITUR working parties and working groups. However, these sharing studies, sometimes it is taking very hard limit, or I'm not saying limit, or how can I say it? It is very hard and to protect the incumbent services. One time, a few years ago, there was a study also we made it here in our country between two services, between fixed satellite services and fixed services, to protect the air station. The limit which was put it based on ITUR studies, it was too much. And when we did in reality, we showed we can have it in very short distance. It was between the air station and the fixed services. In our study, we came up with the fixed station can be there near to the air station antenna, 30 kilometers. In ITU, it was 100 kilometers, something like that. So sometimes the sharing studies, we have to be careful at not to put that too much hard limit in order to protect the incumbent services. We have to see the reality, because keeping the frequency spectrum only for one services, it is in future, it is not the right way. Coming back now to the licensing mechanism, I think the licensing, it is depends from country to country. It is regulatory issues for the country, cannot be put it in the radio regulation. However, yes, for the harmonization, worldwide harmonization sake, it is important to have frequency harmonized between different countries. Between of course, if it will be country worldwide, it will be much better, or regional. And if there is no harmonization, then the ecosystem, it will be difficult. The price of the devices or the network, it will be very high. It is not good for the customer or for the operator also, if they will go by themselves. I saw the question, it was talking about the 6 gigahertz, which is right now, there is a two community, Wi-Fi community, a license or licensing them, and mobile, IMT. Even here, I can tell you this one here in the UAE and some Arab countries, we are studying that one. In the UAE, we had made a questionnaire. This questionnaire to seek opinion from the public all, operator, vendors all, to see what will be their comments on utilization the 6 gigahertz. And we have got very good comments. Yesterday, we have almost concluded our study. We have number of options on how to go to this band. Maybe soon we can hear about it, that either we will go full for Wi-Fi or part of it, or for mobile. But again, we have to be careful that technology is moving very, very fast. And the changing in the radio regulation, it's taking very slow. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I think that's the point we'll come back to. I'm going to let Alexandra in a moment. I just want to pick up on your point about sharing studies and how they inherently tend to be very conservative and result in coexistence distances that are often much too great. And I remember a time when I was at Ofcom, the UK Ofcom, and we were looking at coexistence between LTE at 800 megahertz, TV in the band just below it. And all the studies suggested that there was going to be about 2.3 million homes that would be affected by this interference. And actually, we tested that in that we then rolled the system out, and we had a mechanism in place to address the interference when it occurred. And actually, it was only about 1% of that number of homes that were actually affected, which I think just shows just how inherently conservative almost all these studies actually are. And it seems that actually, perhaps we need a better way to do that. Perhaps we need a way that we can actually dynamically assess the interference and change the parameters of the networks as that changes. And that may be a way that dynamic databases can help us. But before we circle onto that, let's go back to the question from Graham, which Alexandre, you wanted to have a go at answering that one too.
Yeah, thank you, William. Just probably to complement what's also said previously, and now Graham asked whether it is appropriate to have IMT identification in the 6 GHz band, noting that in some countries this is already exempt, the whole band, and also in Europe the lower part is also Erlang. Hopefully it will be Erlang in 2 weeks' time when we adopt our decision. Certainly the technology competition IMT versus Erlang will be implicitly considered when we deal with agenda item 1 or 2. I already said this in my introductory remarks. And we also had a similar discussion at the previous conference when 6671 was considered for IMT. And that time, recognizing that the band 5766 GHz was already unlicensed, the resolution developed and agreed by the conference enabled virtually both technologies to access the band 6671. No sharing mechanisms were defined by the conference, but a call to ITR to develop appropriate recommendations. Now, when we have the whole study period in front of us, or two-thirds of the study period, it is certainly worth studying whether and how coexistence between Erlang and IMT could be achieved in the upper part of the 6 GHz band. And, well, I think we don't have a lot of time, and I stop my intervention here. Thank you.
But I mean, I agree, though. I think rather than saying should the upper 6 GHz band be Wi-Fi or IMT, perhaps the question should be how can it be both? How can we enable both of those systems to operate in the same band at the same time in a manner that fits the needs of both sets of users? And potentially the answer is some kind of clever dynamic sharing, along the lines of a CBRS approach, perhaps, or something like that. Is that being studied? Is that being looked at by any of your groups, rather than simply the kind of A or B type of choice? Muneo, you've not had a chance to say much yet. Any thoughts on that from the APT side?
Well, you talk about the primary service allocated in the regulations. As other people said, that the primary services are not single one. If you see some frequency band, plural number of services are allocated as primary services. So the sharing between primary services is one of the key technical issues which are pursued by technical group. Mm. And the discussion at WRC was when we introduce new service, it's some frequency band, they have to check whether new service can coexist with the existing services. And after confirming that both new service and existing services can coexist, then the decision to assign new allocation is determined by WRC. So such a study is very important, and it takes a certain time to complete such a study. That's why the decision of WRC seems very slow.
Yeah.
And if you consider the primary. Oh, please go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead and finish. I think essentially what APT is saying is that WRC is what we invest in it as the membership, whether from the private sector or everybody that participates in WRC. And of course, as I've mentioned earlier, with more wireless technologies comes the increasing need to dynamically share spectrum. But insofar as we cannot, in a study cycle, agree on the study parameters, technologies do exist now for assisting us to, study with a lot more increased efficiency in terms of how we can dynamically share spectrum. So we need to invest a lot more of our resources in a study cycle to ensure that a lot more consensus is built prior to the WRC, so that it's more of a ratification rather than the protracted debate. So it's WRC is essentially ourselves. What are we investing in a studies process, leading to a serious consensus building process towards WRC? But I think, as I mentioned earlier, WRC is ourselves. We need to just invest in resources and time, and audit the use cases that exist in terms of the needs, and then say this is practical, as my friend from the UAE had said. We are seeing instances where less and less of TV is in our homes, and more of programs are going on to the iPads, to our phones, and to laptops. And so we need to then question whether the resources that are devoted for TV is still going forward going to be necessary as a primary user, and whether we can dynamically share that, agree to share that resource with other users. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I want to let Oscar, and I know, Oscar, you want to talk a bit about the 6 gigahertz band. But before I do that, I'll just throw out a general thought that you can be mulling over whilst Oscar picks up on that point, which is we've now touched on a few times on the problematic timescales of the WRC process, how it can be quite slow. Dynamic sharing gives us a new way to manage spectrum. Do we need a new process to manage spectrum? Do we in fact need WRCs anymore? In fact, do we need the ITU anymore? Is it time to sit back and rethink, in a world where we can dynamically change usage and share, whether actually we need the kind of top-down approach to determining what the use of each band might actually be? So that's one to mull over. But before we pick up on that one, Oscar, do you want to talk a bit more about 6 gigahertz? And also there's a follow-up question from Michael Calabrese, who was on the panel earlier, just saying, does it really make any sense to consider IMT in the upper half of that band, given that other countries have now started to pick up and allocate that band for unlicensed usage? South Korea is the one that he mentions. So Oscar, sorry, that was a long, rambling interlude, but back to you.
No, don't worry. Well, this pandemic has taught us all likely how fundamental to our resilience are the coverage of the networks and the ability to upgrade. And I think Wi-Fi carries much more internet traffic than any other wireless technology, and a large proportion of the 5G data traffic is delivered on the unlicensed basic Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or similar protocols. And I believe opening up 6 GHz frequency bands for Wi-Fi is important to ensure that this widely used wireless technology can deliver the performance needed to future application as networks. Also to support the teleworking, the telestudy that we have in a lot of our countries. So the lower power indoor and very low power can coexist with the existing incumbent services in the band. You see that in the studies that did some of the countries. Also the standard powers airlines operating outdoors cannot coexist with incumbents using coordination as automated frequency coordination. Also, a global IMT harmonization is only expected for the WRC-23 in 100 megahertz of the lower band of the 7 gigahertz. And only region 1 is studying the upper part of 6 gigahertz band. So for me, the regulators in other regions could move forward, enabling Wi-Fi 6E. In this sense, FCC, US, and Chile adopted the full 1,200 megahertz for band for LPI in 6 gigahertz. Costa Rica is finalizing the open consultation. Peru opened the consultation yesterday. Colombia and Mexico are scheduled to consult soon this band.
Yeah, interesting. I agree. It does feel like the world's starting to vote with its feet on that one rather than waiting for WRC-23 to resolve it. Alexandre, you offered to comment on my outrageous suggestions that WRCs might not be needed anymore.
Yes. Thank you, William. Well, you left Ofcom UK a few years ago, but I still need my job by Ofcom Switzerland. If we cancel the conferences, I will have some troubles with my wife. But now, seriously, well, I have no doubts that the sharing can be effective and efficient. However, it doesn't mean that it will replace the global regulatory framework established and maintained by the ITU, including World Radio conferences. When we make use of sharing, it is primarily to assist regulators in the national frequency management. Opportunistic sharing does not address the international or cross-border interference, and neither equitable access to the spectrum by all countries. These are dealt with by radio regulations, which are reviewed and revised on a regular basis by the conferences. So my answer to your question, William, no. Sharing can be complementary to the ITU process, but cannot replace it. In short, thank you.
Yeah.
Can I also weigh in briefly?
Yeah, please, John, and then Tariq after that.
I wish Tariq could go first, but let me have the bite. I think institutions never fail. It is people who do. It is people who make institutions what they are and processes that those institutions follow. And if we are not able to agree in WRC to a dynamic spectrum sharing way, then very well we may not agree in any other framework. And so if there are process issues with the ITU or WRC for that matter, let's fix that process issue, but within an existing, traditional, tested process that has, in my view, in the main worked very well and served the world community fairly, equitably, and various users fairly well, in my view. So let's fix the process, if at all it's not working well, to serve our needs in a dynamic way, rather than replacing or establishing another organization that would perhaps take over that function. That's my view, and I think that is the view that is shared largely in our region. Thank you.
Yeah, those sound like wise words. Tariq, did you want to say something about this?
Well, I first I'll just echo whatever Alex and John, both of them say, and I fully agree with them that we don't need to replace anything here. Radio communication or WRC, ITU process, it's very important for us as a regulator in order to make sure the best utilization of the spectrum and without any interference or anything that sharing it is already with the process going on, it is okay, fine. Maybe just we need to enhance this process and doing something that make the studies more frequent, very quick. We have to go back to see the process. See, WRC, it's held every 4 years. A rate regulation, it's changes every 4 years. And the technologies is changing very, very fast. So our operators, our vendors, our people, our government, even sometimes they cannot wait to see. Sometimes, oh, why we need to wait for 4 years? We need to bring this technology, and why it is not here available in this country or this region? So we have to do something. Unfortunately, we started some time to go outside the radio regulation, which is really, even we did it as Arab group for C-band at 3 gigahertz, but we don't like it, and we don't want to go outside radio regulation. We'd love to be within the radio regulation. However, this statement I have already said before, even with the ITU director sometime, IBR director, that we have to go to visit and to see the process of WRC preparation in order to accommodate the country need, the government need, the operator with the new technologies, which is moving very fast. I was having one slide and sharing with some our even management and say that each generation was changing, third generation, second, fourth, and now fifth generation for mobile every 10 years. But right now, the pace of changing this generation is reducing. It's now we will be coming 7 or 6 years. So we have to go back to the process. However, we are in line with the other regional Arab group that we have to keep this organization, especially BR, and we have to have this radio regulation because it is important as a regulator for us to assign these frequencies for any kind of radio services. But maybe we have to go back and visit because this is very old process, and now we have to see how we can enhance the process.
Thank you. So we've got about 3 minutes left. So I'll just throw out one final question, and feel free to chip in on that or any concluding thoughts. So one of the questions that's come up on the chat, thank you for that, is being, if 4 years is too frequent, why not 2 years or 1 year? And it doesn't need to be such a big event every year. If it was held every year, it could be a quarter of the size or a quarter of the duration or handle a quarter of the issues. It would just happen that certain issues could be picked up more quickly. And if we change that, should also, I think it was a comment that John made, that databases and dynamic access are often considered at a country level, not a regional level, but indeed should we consider it at an ITU level? Should ITU actually be developing databases that can be used by regions or globally to handle sort of sharing systems at that level, rather than leaving it to bubble up in each country with the risk that we end up with different approaches to that? So a couple of issues there. Timescales of WRCs, should it be quicker? Should there be some kind of WRC or ITU approach to sharing? And any final thoughts? And you've each got about 30 seconds to answer those. Who wants to go first on that one? Abe, would you like to, Muneo, would you like to say something on that?
Oh, yes. Well, what should I say? Well, the dynamic spectrum sharing is currently a method which can be employed by the national regulator. And a database is very delicate data, and I would say it's a kind of the classified data, and it is very difficult to release such a data to outside of the countries currently. So it is the spectrum sharing data can be used inside of the country easily, but if you expand such a usage to the outside, maybe regional would be okay in Europe or such a region, but globally, if you expand the usage globally, it may be difficult. But you can arrange such a scheme for safety of life communication in such a limited area. But if you say general issues, currently it's maybe very difficult. In the future, I don't know, but currently it's very difficult
to realize. Alexandra, I'm going to give you the chance for the last word, and then we'll call a halt after that.
Yeah, thank you, William. Well, very interesting panel and so nice questions. I understand the time goes. Just quickly, the question that I see on the chat, and you also repeated that was it will be good to have 2 years conference cycle instead of 4 years? From one hand, of course, we would be more reactive to address the technological innovations and emergency of new technologies. From another hand, the decisions which are taken by the conference are dependent, the quality of the decisions taken by the conference are dependent on the quality of the studies conducted. So if we conduct good studies, the decisions will be valid for many years to come. And we are too quick, then the decisions might be challenged very quickly. Therefore, we should find a good compromise. Probably not 2 years, but 3 years. I remember the times that it was every 3 years. Now it's changed to 4 years, but probably less than 3 years, it will be too short to conduct good studies. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Lots of good points. I'm going to have to bring us to a halt there. We've run out of time. Thank you to you all. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. That was also very informative and a real honour to have so many of the most senior representatives from each of the regional assemblies on one panel. It rarely happens. So with that, I will hand back to Steve.
Thank you, William, for moderating. I think what is ultimately the most challenging of environments, how the accelerating pace of technology can be matched by the pace of regulatory change.